On a cold August night in 1882, the quiet hills of Maamtrasna, a remote settlement on the border of County Galway and County Mayo, became the scene of one of Ireland's most gruesome crimes. In the dead of night, 5 members of the Joyce family were savagely murdered in their own home, leaving a community reeling in horror. The killings sparked a frantic search for justice, but what followed instead was a trial riddled with injustice, where language barriers, forced confessions, and unreliable witnesses led to wrongful convictions and an execution that would haunt Irish history for over a century. The Maamtrasna region, situated on the border of counties Mayo and Galway in the west of Ireland, is an isolated and rugged landscape, and in the late 1800s, a place where Irish was the primary spoken language, English being a dialect largely unencountered by its inhabitants. This region, like much of Ireland, was gripped by poverty, unrest, and growing tensions between Irish tenants and their British landlords. Ireland at the time was still under British rule, and the Land War, a campaign of resistance against excessively high rents and forced evictions, was in full swing. The Irish National Land League, founded in 1879, sought to defend tenant farmers' rights, leading to violent confrontations with landlords and law enforcement. Between high tensions and upheaval, the British authorities were eager to assert control and maintain order, sometimes resorting to severe legal measures, including coercion laws that allowed for the suppression of suspected rebels and harsher penalties for crimes perceived as political. One of the most significant social divides in Ireland at the time was language. While English was the official language of government, courts, and education, Irish remained the dominant tongue in many rural communities, particularly in the West, but the British legal system provided no accommodations for Irish speakers. If a person did not speak English, they were at a distinct disadvantage in court, reliant on interpreters who were often unqualified or indeed biased. In the case of Myles Joyce and the other men later accused of committing this gruesome crime, this linguistic divide would prove fateful. Maamtrasna was a small, close-knit community where families were bound by marriage and kinship. For those living there, life was harsh, with people relying on small-scale farming and occasional labour to survive. The remoteness of the region meant that news travelled slowly, and the people were largely disconnected from the political and social affairs of Dublin and London. But tensions over land disputes between families and the larger political struggles of Ireland created a volatile atmosphere. Violence was not uncommon, with secret societies like the Irish National Invincibles and the Moonlighters enforcing their own brand of justice against landlords and farmers, and those who broke the unwritten codes of rural Ireland. Among those trying to build a life in the area was the Joyce family, who survived through farming, fishing, and raising livestock. John Joyce, the head of the household, was a hard-working man, providing for his wife Bridget, their children Michael, Patrick, and a young daughter, and his elderly mother Margaret. Their life was simple but demanding. But with feuds and disputes so common in Maamtrasna, often tied to land, livestock, or long-standing personal grudges, the Joyces were no strangers to this reality. They had their own share of difficulties with certain members of the community, and though they may not have known it at the time, these tensions would soon spiral into something far more sinister than a simple rural dispute. On the night of Thursday, August the 17th, 1882, the Joyce family had settled in for the night, unaware of the horror that was about to unfold. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, intruders forced their way into the small stone cottage. The wooden door was torn from its hinges, sending a splintering crack through the silence. Inside, John Joyce, his wife, their children, and John's elderly mother were asleep. The attack was merciless. At dawn, on August the 18th, 1882, residents of the Quiet Valley awoke to a scene of horror. Neighbour John Collins was the first to arrive at the Joyce home, finding the house eerily silent. Inside, John Joyce was found lying on the kitchen floor, shot twice in the side, with a deep wound to his head. His wife was killed in bed, her body riddled with bullets. Their daughter, too, was shot and suffered a brutal skull fracture. John's mother was also brutally murdered. The violent attack spared no one except young Patrick, known as Patsy, who, though badly beaten, survived. His elder brother, who was gravely wounded with gunshots to the neck and stomach, clung to life for a short while before succumbing to his injuries. The scene inside the cottage was one of devastation. Blood stained the packed earth floor, and the bodies of the dead lay where they had fallen. The brutality of the crime rocked the small Maamtrasna community. 5 members of the Joyce family had been murdered in their own home, and the search for those responsible was about to begin. But in the small and remote community, gathering reliable testimony was difficult. Fear and silence gripped the people, and while the gruesome nature of the crime suggested premeditation, the true motive remained unclear. Some speculated that it was a targeted act of vengeance, while others believed it was connected to land disputes or accusations of sheep stealing. Attention soon turned to 2 men, Anthony and John Joyce, cousins of the murdered John Joyce, who came forward with a startling claim. They stated that they had seen a group of men travelling toward the home on the night of the murders and had followed them from a distance, later witnessing the attack. Their testimony pointed to 10 men from the surrounding area as the perpetrators. The police acted swiftly, making arrests on August the 20th. The accused, Myles Joyce, his brothers Martin and Porden, his nephew Tom, as well as Pat, Michael and John Casey, Pat Joyce of Shan Valley Kale, Tom Casey of Gleon Sal, and Anthony Philbin were taken into custody. Many of them lived miles away from Maamtrasna, and as they were dragged from their homes, panic and disbelief spread among their families and neighbours. The British press had little sympathy for either accused or victim. The Spectator news magazine described the people of Maamtrasna as scarcely civilized beings, far nearer to savages. The Graphic wrote, "Here we have a tribe rather than a more civilized community, dwelling apart from modern life, speaking a dying language." The trial of the men accused of the Maamtrasna Massacre was a grueling 8-day ordeal that felt more like a formality than a pursuit of justice. The courtroom was tense and was stacked against the accused from the start. The men were Irish speakers, yet the trial was conducted entirely in English, a language they struggled with. A translator, Head Constable Evans, was occasionally brought in, but the process was clumsy and inconsistent, as though their language, their very identity, was an afterthought. From the outset, the trial seemed flawed. Testimonies conflicted, witnesses gave varying descriptions of the attackers, some claiming they wore dark coats, others swearing they had blackened their faces. It was clear the case was shaky, built on contradictions and dubious witness accounts. As the trial progressed, the defence, led by the inexperienced Mr. Malloy, struggled to challenge the evidence. His unfamiliarity with the language and the people he was defending showed in his lack of preparation. The men, many of whom had no understanding of English, found themselves vulnerable to a legal system that seemed uninterested in fairness. The defence's arguments went largely unheard, drowned by the overwhelming force of the Crown's case. Two of the group, Thomas Casey and Anthony Philbin, turned informers for the Crown's case, backing up the story of Anthony Joyce, but stating they were working under the orders of two other men known only as Nee and Kelly. However, neither were sought in connection with the case. One of the most heartbreaking moments came when one of the accused, Myles Joyce, real name Maamtrasna, stood in the dock. A man of quiet dignity, he denied his involvement in the massacre, calmly stating that he had been home with his wife that night. The prosecution, eager to see the trial concluded, pressed for a quick verdict, and the jury deliberated for only 6 minutes before returning with their decision. Guilty. In the face of the conviction, the men's fate was sealed. 5 of the accused, who had admitted to their involvement in the crime, were spared the death penalty by John Spencer, 5th Earl Spencer, and Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, who had been overseeing proceedings, their sentence being commuted to life in penal servitude. But Maamtrasna, Patrick Joyce and Patrick Casey would not see such mercy. All 3 would be hung. While awaiting their date with the noose, the 2 Patricks confessed to their part in the killing, but both were adamant that Maamtrasna played no part and was innocent. Earl John Spencer was informed of this revelation, but simply replied with, "The law must take its course." It would later come to light that the Earl had ordered that the Crown's witnesses should receive handsome payments. John Joyce receiving £250, while Anthony and Patrick would each get 500. These sums were many times the average annual income at the time. The night before the execution, priests visited the men, offering last rites. Shoiga's last words, spoken in Irish, were a final protest of his innocence. "I am as innocent as a child in the cradle." The next morning, the execution took place. But due to a mistake by the executioner, his death was slow and agonizing. While the Patricks' deaths came quickly, Maamtrasna thrashed and struggled after the drop. The executioner, William Marwood, having to resort to pushing his body down with his foot in an effort to expedite the gruesome task. He would later state that the prisoner had somehow managed to place his hand up into the noose. The bungled execution would haunt those who witnessed it, serving as a final grim reminder of the miscarriage of justice that had led to the trial and its fatal outcome. The story of Maamtrasna's wrongful conviction didn't end with his death. In fact, it seemed to intensify after the hangings. Rumours spread that his ghost had been appearing at Galway prison, terrifying the wardens and matrons. Described as a tall, mystic figure, the spirit was said to follow officials, and before long, some of them were requesting transfers. The unsettling reports of his allegedly ghostly presence only deepened the belief that something was terribly wrong with the trial, and the anger over the executions only grew. Shoiga's widow and his brother-in-law were accused of threatening the Crown's witnesses, leading to their imprisonment. The witnesses were given police protection, but that did little to calm the tensions. One night, a violent fight broke out in Boyle's pub in Churchfield. It involved Maamtrasna's family, the witnesses, and a group of constabulary officers. During the brawl, Anthony Joyce, one of the witnesses, was badly injured, his nose slashed by a sword. This violent incident reflected the deep frustration and grief felt by those who believed Maamtrasna and his family had been wronged. Then, in 1884, a shocking revelation came to light. Thomas Casey, the informant who had helped convict Shoiga, confessed that he had sent an innocent man to his death. He admitted to Archbishop Dr. John McAvilly that he had lied about Shoiga's involvement in the murders. The Archbishop called for an inquiry, but the British government dismissed the idea. Instead, the case became a political battle, with many public figures demanding justice for the Maamtrasna man. One of the strongest voices calling for justice was Tim Harrington, a nationalist MP. He launched his own investigation into the trial, speaking to locals and priests who knew the area and the people involved. What he uncovered was damning. The so-called witnesses had lied under oath, and it became clear that Anthony Joyce had learned about the murders only after the fact. He couldn't have seen anything the night of the killings. Harrington's findings showed that the trial had been based on false evidence and a network of lies. He took his findings to the House of Commons, demanding action, and raised concerns about the influence of John Spencer, the man in charge of overseeing the trial. But despite his efforts, the Irish executive refused to release documents that could prove Shoiga's innocence. They also blocked any attempt for an independent inquiry into the case. Years passed, but the fight for justice never stopped. In 2016, two members of the House of Lords, David Alton and the late Eric Lubbock, pushed for a review of the case. Although the British Justice Minister Crispin Blunt admitted that Shoiga was likely innocent, he refused to grant a pardon unless new evidence was found. Then, finally, in April 2018, Shoiga was finally granted a posthumous pardon by President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins. This pardon was a historic moment, the first of its kind for a case that happened before the founding of the Irish state. Though it came too late to undo the harm done to him and his family, it was an acknowledgement of the miscarriage of justice that had haunted Ireland for over a century. To this day, the trial of the Maamtrasna prisoners has left a lasting legacy as a dark chapter in Britain and Ireland's history. Sadly, just one of many. It revealed a justice system tainted by political manipulation, where securing a conviction was more important than uncovering the truth. The wrongful execution of Máire Shoiga was not just a personal tragedy, but a symbol of the deep flaws within a system that completely failed him and others. In a country still grappling with the weight of British rule and the scars of oppression, this miscarriage of justice shows how easily power can be abused and how the voices of the innocent can be silenced. It begs the question, how many more lives have been lost to a system that values control over truth? Gorma agias ve aberanu, gonieri liv, agos feci meri shiv, agos schel ela am, ahorches shav aro, nach ats amax and seal.